Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you take a listen to this. If you do, um, it will help you grow. And this is more like teaching. Paul possessed the ability and blessings from God to both preach and teach. And so this is more teaching. Uh, and this is about Esther, the book of Esther. And it's an interesting book. It is hilarious how God turned things around. So the year was 480 BC, and a massive Persian army marched with determination to face the rebel forces of Athens and its Greek ally Persia against the Greek powers. Ancient sources, now listen to this, number the Persians at 1 million soldiers. Others number it at hundreds of thousands. In any case, Persia is got a massive military display here. At the time, the Persian Empire stretched from modern-day Libya and Africa all the way to Pakistan in Asia. Matter of fact, it was the largest empire in history, the second great empire after Babylonian Empire. But the best that we can tell is that Persia had about 50 million citizens, people in their country. They had conquered the Babylonian Chaldean Empire in 539 BC, and the Persians had settled into the domination in the Middle Eastern world, and it lasted for 200 years before they were replaced by the Greeks, who later were replaced by the Romans. But initially, the region of Greece had been conquered by the Persians under Darius, and that would be about 550. Darius' armies had been defeated by the Athenians at the famous Battle of Marathon in 490. Enraged, Darius was determined to subdue his Greek enemies. He amasses a great army. He's going to go back. He's going to pay them back for winning the battle at Marathon. That was a famous battle where a man ran 26 miles. And obviously, that's where we get the marathon. It's 26 miles. So the king Darius had great intentions to satisfy his thirst for vengeance. But, however, he died before he could exact his vengeance. And the quest for vengeance fell to his son, the son of Darius. This is a man named XERXES. A famous name to people who at least study history, who lives from 519 to 465 BC, rises to power in 486, and when he takes the throne, his first order of business is to deal with Egypt in Babylon because they are giving him trouble and he has to subdue them. He's unable then to set his sights on Greece to wreak the vengeance of his father. But by 481, he's ready to attack. So Xerxes gets together to get vengeance on Greece for what they did during his father's reign. He gets together an army of 250,000 men. They're stacked in modern-day Turkey, and they're waiting for orders to cross into Greece. Now, in order to cross into Greece, they're going to have means to get across. They are making all the plans for that, and they do it. So they cross into Greece. Um, but things didn't go as Xerxes planned. His armies reached Athens. They sacked the city, but the Greeks ultimately defeat the Persians and drive them back out of Greece. So Xerxes did not, like his father, accomplish beating the Greeks. And as you know, there's some famous battles of Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans, uh, the Battle of Salamis, uh, where 300, it's counted 300 ships of the Navy was sunk, and all that points out the hatred between Greece and Persia. This is inflamed by defeat over and over. Xerxes fights repeatedly against the Greeks, and he does make some headway, but more defeat than success, until finally a man comes along by the name of Alexander the Great, who is a Greek, and the Persian Empire is defeated for good. And Alexander the Great conquers the Middle Eastern world and establishes as what we know as the Great Greek Empire. Now, this is about the book of Esther, and you're going to say, what has this got to do with Esther? And there's more details. If you read in the book of Hebrews, you can find more details. But it has this to do with the book of Esther. The emperor, whom the Greeks called Xerxes, that I've been talking about, has a different name in Persia. His name is Khasasarasha. In Hebrew, Hashavirash. In your English, Ahasuerus. And that's the name you're going to find in the book of Esther. The king in the book of Esther is none other than Xerxes, the son of Darius, who fought the Greeks and ultimately lost the Persian Empire to the power of the Greeks. This is the man who tried to conquer Greece with 250,000 soldiers. This is the man Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, who is the one who becomes ruler of that empire after the death of his father, and he is the man who has his heart conquered by this Jewish orphan named Esther. And when the opportunity came, she would use her influence to save the Jewish race from genocide. That is what the book of Esther is about. And it's about nothing else. And this is about one woman who, by the providence of God, saved an entire nation. So, when you say God was not mentioned, you have to look again. He's all over the book of Esther. The book has her name not because she wrote it, she didn't write it. It's not clear who did write it, but it's certainly someone who understands the Persian scene and somebody who also understood the Jewish culture and had a detailed knowledge of both. This is the author, ever who that may be. But whoever the author is, the real author of the story is God. See, God is the author of the book of Esther. Behind this richly played out labyrinth of events is divine providence. Divine providence is vast. So, at the beginning of the book, you can open to chapter 1. Open your book up and look at chapter 1. We're going to be, we're going to get through this quickly as possible. The book opens by describing the expansive kingdom of Xerxes or Ahasuerus, and it stretches from Ethiopia to India, all the way from modern Libya to Pakistan. He is not only the son of Darius, he's the grandson of Cyrus the Great, the Persian ruler who decreed that the Jews could go back to their land after 70 years of captivity. Cyrus the Great was just what it says, Cyrus the Great. And this is how the book begins. Many Jews went back to Israel under the decree of Cyrus, the grandfather of Xerxes. They went back, they rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, they rebuilt the temple, the second temple, they reestablished themselves in the land. However, there were a large number of those Jewish people who had been exiled to Babylon who remained there. They settled, they scattered, they proliferated, and they were all through the Persian Empire. So all through the Persian Empire we see the Jewish people. They had reestablished themselves and after the 70 years. Several years into the reign of Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, the book of Esther opens when he calls a 6-month summit the king in the capital city of Shushan, or Susa as it's called. This occurred in 483 BC. And this is a strategic war planning meeting, a 6-month war strategy session. And what it is about, the king is going to make his final preparations for the invasion of Greece. So you have this war minds getting together, this 6-month deal. They're going to make plans how they're going to finally conquer Greece. He's confident in his ability to knock off Greece, confident that his military forces are going to be the winners. So he ends the 6-month summit of military planning with a 7-day banquet. Now we're getting into this. Look at your Bible at Esther chapter 1 and see the celebration. It is extremely extravagant. He anticipated victory. They had their war plans all worked out. So now they're having this celebration. There were white and blue linen curtains. Verse 6, fastened with cords of fine linen, purple silver rods. This place was decked out. On the 7th day of the feast of Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, after a week of intoxication and indulgence, decides he wants to put his wife on display. Her name is Vashti, Queen Vashti. So he commands his wife to show up on the 7th day and presents herself in her royal dress. So here the king, he is decided he's going to put his wife on display, her beauty, her dress, her royalty, on the 7th day. And she says no. She tells the king no. I'm not coming to your party, probably because she didn't want to destroy her dignity. I mean, 7 days of drunk people, and the king wants to put her on display here. She doesn't want any part of it, so she doesn't go. Some think that she was actually pregnant and obviously didn't feel comfortable or beautified in her clothes. She said, I'm not coming. He becomes furious. This is a public deal, a great deal of people here. It's a great celebration. And according to chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, he's afraid that the queen's action will start a woman's liberation movement. That if the queen can't get away with this, or can get away with saying no, then every woman will also begin to, you know, rule the roost. So, what's he do to his queen? Well, he demotes her. She was once a queen, now she's not. Uh, and then he spreads the word that he's going to get a new queen. He spreads the word throughout his empire. He's going to get a new queen to replace her because she did not follow what he had said. Now, to understand his violent temper, a year later, in order for his army to march from Turkey, where they were assembled, as I mentioned before, into Greece, Xerxes, or Xerxes, ordered that bridges be built across Hellespont. That's the narrow piece of water between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. They needed to get through there to get to Greece. The bridges that they built were destroyed by a storm. The troops were not able to use them. The Xerxes was furious that his bridges were destroyed. And so what does he do? The engineers that built the bridges, he put them to death. And then after that, he took and had his men take whips, go out into the water, and whip the water 300 lashes each. Guy's crazy. And then on top of that, he has them heat swords red hot and to go out and stab the waves. Now, this is how angry he was, how out of control he was. This was the man that his queen didn't obey him. He just said, you're gone, you're out. I mean, this is an irrational rage, obviously, but this is an explanation why he treated his queen that way. He surely had rage when she didn't do, and he just said goodbye. So anyway, 4 years pass, and there's no queen. According to Esther chapter 2, verse 16, 4 years pass before he gets around to selecting a new queen. And the reason it's 4 years, it's found in his 2-year unsuccessful invasion of Greece, the very thing that I mentioned before. So he spent 2 years trying to take and win Greece and not being successful. And then the invasion of Greece happens in that 2 years, and it occupies him so that he can't deal with the issue of establishing a queen. So his time is taken up in this battle, this 2-year battle. uh, against Greece, and that was about 483, 482 BC. And we see that Esther's coronation is 479. Only about 3 years later, she will be coronated as queen. He finally is so frustrated by his inability to conquer Greece that he comes back home after 2 years of effort, and he decides that since war is going so bad, he needs a distraction. And the distraction will be selecting a new queen. Look at chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. After these things, when the wrath of King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the province of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins." So Susa, the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women's, that of course, a harem, in case you are wondering, what that would be. It's a harem, what they call a harem. And in that time, in this year time, let beauty preparations be given them, and then let the young woman who pleases the queen be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. This is going to be an empire-wide beauty contest, and we could make sort of general assumption that if there are 50 million people in the Persian Empire, there are about 25 million women. Interesting. But they're going to be virgins. At that point, the biblical text introduces us to two main people in the story, two Jewish people who are cousins. They live in the city of Susa as well. They are descendants of the original Jewish captives that were taken by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon captivity. They were brought to Babylon a century earlier, or their parents, and that was around 597. The older of the two cousins, is a man named Mordecai, and he's roughly 15 years old than his cousin. So he's 15 years older than Esther. Esther is an orphan. Both her verse 7 says that her parents had died when she was very young, so Mordecai had raised her. So here in the middle of 50 million people in the Persian Empire, there are two Jewish people. Her name in Hebrew, Hadassah, and it means myrtle or plant. Her Persian name was Esther, may be related to Ishtar, one of the Babylonian gods, and it may also be because of the similarity of the Persian word for star. Babylonian goddess Ishtar, who just happened to be the goddess of love. That was not her Jewish name, though. But the Jews in exile were given Persian names like Daniel, his three friends, whose original name was Azariah, Mishael, Hananiah, but became Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Those were Babylonian names. Now the Bible next. Now look at chapter 2, verse 7. Says that it just so happened that this young virgin by the name of Ishtar was lovely and beautiful, lovely and very beautiful. She didn't go unnoticed by the king's officials, so she was collected in the group that were to go to the palace and live in the harem with the concubines and participate in the contest for the queens. Now, Josephus, the historian, says there were 400 virgins who were taken. Uh, it was 400 virgins, so it just trickled down. Ever what they started with, they ended up with 400 virgins. They were taken to the palace because they were going to be there for a year. They were going to be allowed to kind of work on their selves, their etiquette, learn how to carry themselves in a palace, and all the rules that may be involved. And at some point, when that year was over, they would be presented to the king. He would be able to make his choice. One of them would be elevated to be the queen, and they had a year of this primping, which that's the way they did it. But nonetheless, I don't exactly know what all might have gone on. A year of beautification. They were to look as beautiful as possible. They were to smell as good as possible. They were to use incense, cosmetics. They were to enhance their skin. They were to enhance their hair. They were to develop pleasant fragrance. They were to be given special instructions, etiquette, and so on. And of course, at the end of all that, a year, he was going to pick his queen. But at the time, she would then adorn herself with whatever jewelry, whatever apparel desired, and she would present to the ruler. The day after her presentation, she would go back into the pool, back into the pool of waiting ladies, other concubines, members of the 400. Esther is probably in her 20s. She has completed the year-long order, and it's her turn to appear before XERXES, or Ahasuerus. Chapter 2, verse 16. So Esther was taken to King Xerxes into his royal palace into the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And then the king loved Esther more than all the other women. So you think about all the women that he looked at, 400 according to Josephus, historian. It was Esther who caught his attention immediately. She must have been alluring, beautiful, but there must have been something about her that, and I would say probably her innocence of honesty. Esther stole the king's heart. Esther became his queen, an obscure Jewish orphan. So Esther, an orphan, parents died. Uh, she was raised by Mordecai, her cousin, an exiled people, a conquered people. But here she is exalted to the highest position that any woman could have in the entire world at that time. And you've got to know this is not a coincidence. There's a power working in her life. There's a power at work providentially in her life. And through the entire process, Esther keeps her Jewishness a secret. Mordecai told her to do that because there was much anti-Semitism in the Persian Empire. You can see that in chapter 4, verse 6. Esther would reveal that she was Jewish, but only at the very most important and necessary time. So she pretty well kept it to herself she was Jewish. People didn't like Jews, even though there were Jews there, many Jews. So Esther was chosen to be the queen. She has gone from being an obscure little Jewish orphan girl to being a queen. It is driven by her physical beauty and her charm. Not long after Esther is crowned, and this is where the story gets, actually where it begins, Her cousin Mordecai is sitting at the entrance to the palace. He's hanging around the palace. This is Esther, someone he raised, so he's hanging around to see, what's going on. He's concerned about her, and his main thing, he knows she's Jewish, and he's just very careful about her. And while he's hanging around the palace, verse 21 tells us two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. They were going to plot to kill the king, is what they were doing. He overhears the plot to kill the king, to assassinate the king. These were actually guards that guarded the king. And so Mordecai, at one point in time, he gets this information to Esther. Esther gets it to the king. These assassination plans, these two were took to the gallows, and Mordecai's deed was put down in the Book of Hours. They would Persians were notorious about recording everything anyway. They have great history. And then on top of that, those that did valor things such as this, their names were recorded, what they did, when they did it, and so on, because the king always wanted to make sure that he rewarded these people. It was, you can understand politically, that's good for him. So he reported it immediately. The message is so. The matter became known to Mordecai. He told the queen Esther, and Esther informed the king, and they were hanged. And as I said, it was recorded. And these recordings are very important. I mean, think about it. You want to write this stuff down, somebody did this, did that, so you go back, you reward them. They speak of how the king rewarded them to the other people, and so it just is a brilliant political move. I mean, anybody should do that. Now, all of that is chapter 2. You come into chapter 3 and you're introduced to the next main character of the book. Now, this is where the heart of the book of Esther begins. A man named Haman. Haman, this is a man who had been exalted by the king, a capable man, a Persian man, a man who had been lifted up above other princesses and officials. But the thing is, what you have to understand about Haman, he was a Agagite. It's in 3, 1, and 10, it says it again in chapter 8, says it again in chapter 9, Haman was an Agagite. Now, to understand why it's important of his being an Agagite, you have to go back. You have to go back a little bit. You have to go back about 1,000 years to the Exodus from Egypt, when Israel came out of Egypt. The Israelites came out of Egypt around 1445, so we're about nearly 1,000 years. And they were attacked in the 17th chapter of Exodus by the Amalekites. Remember that name. The Amalekites attacked them. The Amalekites are descendants of Esau, the one who sold his birthright. The Amalekites attacked the Jews. God curses Amalekites, and God curses in Deuteronomy 25, says one day they are going to be extinct. 4 centuries later, King Saul conquers the Amalekites. absolutely destroys everyone except for the king. God had told Saul to destroy everyone, every last one of them, but he didn't destroy the king. Samuel the prophet comes, finds this out. He is absolutely beside himself because they didn't obey God. Saul didn't obey God. This is why Saul lost his power. This is why Saul was pretty well begrudged of the blessings of God and the position that he was in. So Samuel, what does he do? He takes a sword and he hacks his king to pieces. He just whacks him, cuts him up, does according to the will of God. Now, many say the Amalekites, and you find this to be true in some of the scripture, the Amalekites were giants. See, speak of the giants. So, and you remember, if you know this, the Israel had went and spied some of them out, and they said they were like grasshoppers among them. So at any rate, they were to be destroyed. Saul didn't do it. He left the king alive. Samuel kills their king. And this was what Haman in Persia now is absolutely furious about. He knows his history. He knows the family history. He knows Mordecai is a Jew. He knows the bloodbath that pursued, that took place. And Haman is going to exact revenge on all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Now remember, Haman is he's pretty high authority. And then on top of that, Mordecai, he's a descendant of the Kish, which is the Benjamites, where Saul came from. Saul was a Benjamite too. So you see, this Haman was out for blood, especially Mordecai being of the same tribe as Saul. And this hostility, it erupts in chapter 3. Look at verse 2. And uh, and we'll go down to 5. All the king's servants who were written within the king's gates bound and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded. He had been elevated so high that everybody had to bow to him, but Mordecai wouldn't bow or pay homage. That feud settled in his heart deeply. He had nothing but animosity toward the cursed Amalekite descendant. When Haman saw that Mordecai didn't bow or pay homage, Haman was filled with wrath, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for that had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. In other words, he held off on killing Mordecai because he's going to get rid of all the Jews. He's just absolutely going to get rid of them. And he decided that he couldn't just kill Mordecai. So what's he do? Haman goes to the magicians and astrologers, and he says, I want you to determine the optimum day by looking into your mystical sources and find a day to annihilate the Jewish people, and we'll have genocide all through the Persian Empire on that one day. He then goes to the king. He says to the king, this nation, this Persian Empire is full of Jews, and they are a threat to you. They are a threat to your throne, to your empire, and they ought to be eliminated. He says they ought to be killed all the way back to Israel. So Haman is exacting revenge. Not for Persian Empire, it's his own hatred for the Jewish people. He tells the king these people are a threat. If we kill them all, we can confiscate all their property and all their spoils, everything they own, and a vast sum of money will come into royalty treasure. Xerxes says, great idea. Hands his signet ring over to Haman so that he can stamp the proper documents. They will authorize genocide for the Jews. Haman hits the fast track, dispatches a royal decree, sends it all throughout the empire, and they did it like the Pony Express. True enough. Yeah. A horse would ride from one place to another, bringing this message of the day of genocide of all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Look at verse 13 of Esther 3. To destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, all of them. In verse 3 of chapter 4 it says, in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. A message stretched across the massive Persian Empire very rapidly that a date had been set for the people in all their own local areas to slaughter the Jews. So the way it was, the day was set, and on this particular day in each city, you might say, or each province, the Jews were to be slaughtered. That's the way it was set up. But when Mordecai heard about this genocide decree, it broke his heart. To genocide, to kill all the people, just to slay them. It was just a payback. Haman was just doing payback in his eyes. He just wanted to destroy the Jews. But see, here's the thing. It was larger than that. This was the hand of Satan, again, trying to destroy the Jewish people, wherein who would come? The Messiah. Kill the people? No Messiah, is the thinking of Satan. So this was the plan. Satan is involved in efforts to obliterate the Jewish people and thus to bring to a halt God's purpose of redemption on their behalf. It didn't take long for the news to reach Esther. She gets the message. Mordecai informs Esther of what Haman has succeeded in accomplishing and even gives her a copy of the royal decree. And he says to her, Esther, you have to go to the king and plead for the lives of your people. Well, here's a problem with that. One thing, if you went before the king and you weren't ordered to come before the king, then it was a law that you be killed on the spot. So here Esther's facing a real situation. Even though she's the queen, it didn't matter. Because you remember, Vashti was kicked out simply because she didn't follow a simple order. This was a big law, and it was often carried out. And so here she's got a dilemma. She says, Mordecai, I can't do that. I'll lose my life. Mordecai told her, you're Jewish. You're going to lose your life anyway, whether you're in the palace or not. This thing Haman is doing it's going to be a bloodbath, and you're not going to survive. And if you look at chapter 4, verse 11, all the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court of the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out his golden scepter that they may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. It's been a full 30 days. Esther's never even seen the king. If she walks in there, in her mind, she's going to be killed. So, this is a problem. He didn't get around to Esther for a month. She was afraid of potentially violating her irrational husband, who had demoted Vashti for one act of non-compliance, and Mordecai was putting Esther in a position where she could die. So what happened? Esther tells Esther tells Esther tells Mordecai to go fast and pray for 3 days, and she will do the same with her probably other Jewish women that she knew within the palace. So this was a situation. If she went before the king, she could die. If she didn't go for the king, she definitely was going to die. And so we see what happened. What is she going to do? How is she going to deal with this situation? So, after fasting for 3 days and after these things, she finally decides to go before the king. Now, what you have to know is Haman had so much hatred toward Jews and toward Mordecai that he had already built a gallows to kill Mordecai. He's going to kill Mordecai. He's going to take his life. Now, so Haman comes into the king. He's going to tell the king he's going to take the life of Mordecai, going to put him on the gallows. And before Haman could even open his mouth, the king tells Haman, what do you do for a man who, in other words, brings honor to the king? Does a very good thing for the king. And Haman thought the king was talking about him. Haman replies, put him on the king's horses, have a prince parade before him, saying, to paraphrase, saying, this is what happens when you put your king first. Now that's a paraphrase. And parading through the city in providence and in this honor. And the king says, I agree. Go down, get the horse you speak of, and go get Mordecai, place him on the horse. And it was Mordecai, the very one that he had come to tell the king he was going to put to death. So instead of that, Mordecai ends up on the king's horse, paraded around the whole providence, being honored by the people, by the king. And it was Haman who was the prince going before Mordecai saying, honor to this man, honor to this man. Now this really brought anger to Haman. I mean, it just more than he could bear. Okay? But that's the way the providence of God works. Haman, Satan, set out to destroy Mordecai. God lifts Mordecai up in such a way that he's honored. He's seen with great honor because the king, the night before, had read in the Chronicles where that Mordecai had turned in these two eunuchs that were going to assassinate him. So, or assassinate the king. So, he called his servants and said, "Is this Mordecai, has he been rewarded?" No. Okay. So this saved Mordecai's life. It elevated him. And so then, at this point, Esther, she goes before the king. She don't know what's going to happen. She don't know if she's going to be put to death. She don't know. She knows the rule, the law. She just doesn't know what's going to happen. She approaches the king at her appointed time, and she's standing there, scared, nervous. And then the king hands her his scepter. That gives her permission to speak. So, and he tells her, in other words, what is it that you want? Up to the half of the kingdom, I'll give it to you. And so what he does, or what she does, she says she wants to have a banquet, her, the king, and Haman, a private banquet. And then in this banquet that day, she will tell the king what she desires. Okay? They had the banquet. The king asked her, "What is it you desire?" He says, "Up until the half of the kingdom I will give to you." She obviously had a great impression on the king, more than anyone. But something happened. She couldn't speak to what she wanted to do. Maybe bad timing, maybe she got nervous and scared and just couldn't utter what she needed to say. And so she says, "Let us return tomorrow, have a private banquet again, you, myself, and Haman." So here's what happened. Haman goes back to the palace on the second banquet, trying to steady his heart rate, sits down for another horrifying surprise. Now, his first horrifying surprise was when Mordecai was held in honor. That was just almost more than he could handle. And the king, again overwhelmed by affection for his queen, asked her what she wants. And her, at the second banquet, she does not hesitate. Chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me, and my petition, and my people at my request. Would you spare my life and the life of my people, for we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated." The king was absolutely beside himself when he hears this. And he's enraged. With the way he hears this is someone is threatening the life of his queen, and that's just not something that can be done. Someone is threatening her people. He takes it. That's something he cannot tolerate. The king is beside himself, furious. He goes out into the garden and he's just so full of rage. So then he returns. Who is this? Who's doing this? And she points to Haman. Right here. This man said him right here is the one that wants to do this. And the king, now also on top of that, when the king had returned from the garden, Haman was down on his knees begging Esther for mercy. He knows he's in big trouble now, you know. But when the king enters back into the room, it looks like that Haman is overtaking the queen. He sees this and he is absolutely enraged. Enraged. So what happens? He so fixes it that this genocide does not take place, although many people did die, but the genocide didn't take place. But at that same time, Haman was taken out on the gallows and hung. It was the very gallows that he built to hang Mordecai on. And instead, Haman was hanged. Mordecai was elevated to a high power position. The Jewish people prospered, all because of Esther, his queen. And this is what the book of Esther about. When you say, well, it doesn't mention the name of God, well, you see Haman, the enemy of God, you say, he was hung on the very gallows that Mordecai was going to be hung on. That Haman had it planned that way. Instead, Mordecai was elevated in a show of parade around Providence. So now he thinks he's going to go destroy all the Jewish people, and he ends up being the one destroyed. All this hatred of how his people were destroyed and killed and murdered, we see it was put to an end. For this man of hatred was destroyed. The Jewish people prospered well in that time. This is the book of Esther. This is what it's about. And you can study to get a better picture, but this will help you. God bless.